Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, the fantastic program where I talk about all the stuff I read during the previous week. And this week, it was Conan. It was all Conan. Everything I read was Conan. Because we are in the middle of Samaran September, the magnificent reading event that celebrates Robert E. Howard and his greatest creation, Conan the Barbarian. And this year I set myself to reread, because I had read these all when I was a teenager. I set myself the task of rereading L. Sprague de Camp's set of Conan books that came out starting in the late 60s and into the 1970s. And this was a series of books that introduced most people to Conan. And the way he set about doing it, well, if you've caught my previous episodes, you know how I feel about this set of books. L. Sprague de Camp decided not just to publish these books, publish Robert E. Howard in paperback, but that he decided he would add to the series. So we have Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories, all mixed up with pastiche fiction written by L. Sprague de Camp himself and also Lynn Carter. And he took some stories that were Robert E. Howard stories that he wrote, that were historical stories that he wrote, that at the time were unpublished in paperback, and he changed them and turned them into Conan stories. And he also took some fragments of Conan stories and outlines of Conan stories that Robert E. Howard never finished, and he finished them for Robert E. Howard. Posthumous collaborations. He collaborated with a dead guy. So, I thought I was the only one who did that. But no, L. Sprague de Camp did it first. Or did it before me. He wasn't the first to do this. Posthumous collaborations. So, yeah, I'm annoyed by this set of books, and have been for years, just because of the way L. Sprague de Camp went about it. Originally, according to the first volume that was ever published, Conan the Adventurer, he had planned this to be an 8-volume set of books, which was probably going to be all Robert E. Howard, except for the unfinished stories that L. Sprague de Camp finished for him in his posthumous collaborations. And probably the historical stories that L. Sprague de Camp changed into Conan stories. Those might have been shoved in there as well to make an 8-volume set. But that wasn't enough. L. Sprague de Camp had to add, to fill in the gaps of Conan's career. And every time he filled in a gap, there was another gap, so he had to keep writing more. Anyway, I've been reading this set of books. A set of books I never had good feelings for or about. But it was recommended to me, hey, Mike, you haven't read these since you were a teenager, and yet you're always being so judgy about this set of books. Why don't you read it? Now, as an adult person, maybe your opinion will change. Yeah, my opinion has actually changed on this set of books. I hate it worse than ever. I hate what L. Sprague de Camp did more than I ever have now that I've read more of these. So how far have I gotten along in this series so far? Let's talk about it. Okay, let's break out my list for my 500 book challenge, the Thrill Pack Challenge, where I have to read 500 books that I already own before I will buy any new ones. I can get them from other people, though. Sometimes people send me books. And actually, after I'm done talking about these Conan books, I did get something in the mail from a friend of mine, which almost certainly is a book, judging from the way it feels. And we will find out together what that is after I'm done talking about these Conan books. But on the challenge, book 180 on the challenge was Conan the Adventurer, which I finished up. So this past week, I decided to read nothing except these Conan books. I thought, because I normally read Fantastic Four as well, because I'm reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. But I put that aside and decided to use all of my reading time to try to get through these paperbacks. And I got through a fair amount. So I finished Conan the Adventurer, which is mostly good because it's mostly Robert E. Howard's original stories. Now, one of the stories in here is a story called Drums of Tumbalku, which was found among Howard's papers. And L. Sprague de Camp took it upon himself to finish the story, which Robert E. Howard almost certainly never intended to finish. It's not a very good story. It just isn't. It's not very good. And I could see why Robert E. Howard got to a point and he's like, you know what? This is not working. I'm going to set this aside and work on something else. It was a false start, I think. And, you know, that's something that happens to writers. You know, they start stories sometimes and they don't work out. And they put them aside and work on something else that will work. Never knowing that years after they were dead, they would collaborate posthumously with a science fiction writer who would finish the story, whether you like it or not, and publish it. So it just wasn't great. And so Robert E. Howard wrote an outline and he started the story, didn't finish it, put it aside. And L. Sprague de Camp finished it. It's just not very good, frankly. Certainly not as good as the other stuff in this volume, because there's some great stuff in here. We've got The People of the Black Circle, which is one of the best Conan stories. The Slithering Shadow is not one of the best Conan stories, but it's one I like an awful lot. And The Pool of the Black One, which is really good. That's a really good story. So this is a good volume. And it was, you know, for a lot of people, since this was the first book of this series that was actually published, this, for a lot of people, was the first time they had ever read Conan at all. And of course, they were going to pick it up. Look at that cover. How could you not pick up a book with this Frank Frazetta cover? And it's a pretty good volume, so I could see why they would want to buy more. So the next book in the series is this book. And this was on the challenge, book 181. This is book 181, Conan the Buccaneer. Great cover by Frank Frazetta. Much better than the book itself. So this is an original novel that was written by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. Together, they wrote this novel. It's not great. This is certainly not the worst Conan novel I've ever read. It's not the worst Conan novel ever. It's just, well, here's the thing about this book. So this is just a book by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp. Robert E. Howard had nothing to do with this, except to inspire pretty much the whole thing. As a commenter on one of my videos said, before I had read this book, this commenter mentioning this book said, this book is just a book that just basically lifts a bunch of different ideas and situations from different Conan stories and puts it all in one book. And when I read it, I found that commenter was actually absolutely right. That's what this is. You start the book, and it's a scene straight out of Black Colossus. And then you move on, and suddenly you're in a scene that's ripped right out of Hour of the Dragon. And it's like that throughout the whole book. It's almost as if L. Sprague de Camp had gone to the future and had AI write a Conan book for him, and it just lifted all of the. It's not that bad, but it's like it just lifted all of these ideas from other Conan stories that were written by Robert E. Howard, and in some cases, written by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. So there's nothing original in this book. It's just all rehashed from other Conan stories. The Conan in this book sometimes feels like Conan, and at other times it feels like imposter Conan. You know, Conan is Conan, right? But this character is like, hi, I'm Conan. Crom. And it's just, it never convinces you. This guy he just doesn't convince. Every once in a while, he's like, hey, he's chopping people's heads off. It's Conan. And then it's like, who is this guy? You know? It has that feel, which wouldn't be so bad if it were just a pastiche novel on its own. But L. Sprague de Camp shoved this in the middle of his series of what are supposed to be the canonical Conan stories. And so, according to L. Sprague de Camp, who was editing this series, this is part of the Conan saga. This happened in Conan's life. And it's Conan the Buccaneer. It's not great. It's a not great. I mean, Grammaticus liked this book. There's some people that like this book. I think it's mostly crap. I think this book is just mostly rehashed crap. Because if you're going to rehash a bunch of stuff from other stories, you at least have to put something else in there. You have to put something else that's going to be like, oh, wow, this grabs my interest, or this is new. Or it has to have something else other than just rehash. Because otherwise, why read it? You could just read Robert E. Howard's original stuff. This just feels completely like a space filler. It's unnecessary. It's entertaining, in its own way. And I would not object to it if it were not in this series, if it were just, published later on its own as just a Conan pastiche. Like I said, I've read a lot worse Conan books than this one. It's just kind of like, it is what it is. It's Conan the Buccaneer. So after that, I read book 182, Conan the Warrior, which is pretty damn good. So there's a scene right out of Beyond the Black River, which is one of the greatest Conan stories of all time, written by Robert E. Howard. Great cover by Frank Frazetta, as usual. So this is all Robert E. Howard, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. It has to be so that L. Sprague de Camp can put his name on it. This is L. Sprague de Camp's meal ticket, Conan. So he has to put his name on everything, whether, and if it was just Robert E. Howard stories, he had to change a word here and there somewhere just in order for him to get editing credit, So this is pretty great because it's Robert E. Howard. It's Robert E. Howard's Conan. And this has Red Nails, Jewels of Gwalar, which is not the best Conan story, but I've always liked it. I think it's pretty good. But it's not as great as Red Nails. And it's certainly not as great as Beyond the Black River, which is in this book. And that's just a magnificent story. That's just great. So that was Conan the Warrior. This is pretty good. Then we move on to 183, which was Conan the Usurper. Man, I read a lot of Conan this week. First of all, look at that cover. And how beautiful is that? That's from the Scarlet Citadel. Conan, the kidnapped king, in this case. And he faces off against that giant snake. That is fantastic. One of my favorite covers out of the whole series. So this book kind of demonstrates what I really hate about L. Sprague de Camp and what he did. So he took a story called The Black Stranger, which, to be fair, was not the greatest Conan story in the world. It had issues, and he turned it into The Treasure of Tranikos. L. Sprague de Camp tore this story apart and basically rewrote it. So The Black Stranger had its issues as a Conan story. And in fact, it was rejected by Weird Tales because it just seemed kind of weird. It seemed kind of experimental. It was an oddity because it was a Conan story that was inspired by Nathaniel Hawthorne, of all writers. And if you're going to have a Conan story that's partially at least inspired by Nathaniel Hawthorne's work, you're going to get a weird Conan story, which is what you got. That wasn't the only inspiration, but it's clearly there. And some people love this story. Some Robert E. Howard fans love it. Some hate it. Some just think it's okay. I happen to think it's good. It's just weird, and it is. There's things that really work well in this story, and things that just seem odd. First of all, everybody talks too much. Conan talks too much in this story. There's a big chunk in the middle of the story where not much happens. And it's just strange. It's just a weird story. But that in itself, its very weirdness, make it interesting. Okay, it's not typical. It's not a typical Conan story. It's an unusual Conan story. Robert E. Howard is doing something different here, which was not successful. It was not entirely successful, but it was interesting. So L. Sprague de Camp took the story and he made it conventional. He made it a conventional Conan story. De Camp's version of The Black Stranger, The Treasure of Tranicos, is a pretty good read as a Conan story. It's not bad. And some people think it's better than the original version, The Black Stranger. But basically, what he did is he took everything interesting out of the story and just made it a conventional Conan story. And if you want that, fine. But that's not what this was. The Black Stranger was something different. It was something unique. Perhaps not successful, but like I said, that makes it interesting. And he just destroyed that. Whether he liked it or not, he should have left it the way it was, and let us judge as readers what we felt about the story. But he didn't give us the chance, L. Sprague de Camp, because he didn't give two craps about Robert E. Howard's writing, really. He didn't. He always felt that he was the better writer, right? L. Sprague de Camp was a serious writer who was slumming it here with Conan. And like I said before, this is where he made all his money. So there's the Treasure of Tranicos, and it just kind of demonstrates what I don't like about L. Sprague de Camp. Then he takes Wolves Behind the Border, which is published in this for the first time. Again, another half of a story that was, half an outline. No, it was an outline and half of a story or something like that. And it was finished by L. Sprague de Camp. Again, it was a Hyborian Age story that Conan isn't in, really, which Robert E. Howard, for whatever reason, didn't finish. Another posthumous collaboration. So there's that. And then there is two great stories. The Phoenix on the Sword, which was the very first Conan story written. And we get it here in, what volume is this? 8? We get it here in volume 8 because L. Sprague de Camp had to make everything in some kind of chronological order instead of the order in which the stories were written. But The Scarlet Citadel is a great story. Then we have, The Phoenix on the Sword was that one. That was a great story. And then we have The Scarlet Citadel, which is wonderful. It's a magnificent story. And both those stories, The Phoenix on the Sword and The Scarlet Citadel, are stories that take place when Conan is a king. So, yeah, it's great. Those are great stories. So this is a pretty mixed bag as a book, in my opinion. So what am I reading right now? Well, I'm reading Conan the Conqueror, which is all Robert E. Howard, except for minor little tweaks by L. Sprague de Camp. Because L. Sprague de Camp has to put his name on this, can't just say, hey, this is a novel, the only full-length novel written by Robert E. Howard, originally titled The Hour of the Dragon. That's the actual title of this story. Turned into Conan the Conqueror when it was published in hardcover in the 50s. Okay, change the name. Fine. But it is the last work in this series written by Robert E. Howard. This is the end of the series, really. It's chronologically. This is the last word on Conan chronologically as it was written by Robert E. Howard. Great, great story. It's one of my favorite Conan stories, The Hour of the Dragon. So I'm reading it again in this edition, which is not the way to read it because it has been tweaked here and there in a minor fashion by L. Sprague de Camp, where he changed some words here and there. He has to keep his hand in, has to get the cash for this book. The way I would read it, you could find it in this volume. This is The Bloody Crown of Conan. There are 3 Conan stories in this, including The Hour of the Dragon. Get this one. This is the real version in this book. But I'm reading it as part of the series. And so yeah, that's what I'm reading now, and I'm going to finish the last 3 books in the series. What do we have coming up? We've got Conan the Avenger, Conan of Aquilonia, and Conan of the Isles. Conan of the Isles, the last book in this series, which I remember being terrible. Will it still be terrible? I will see when I read it. So yeah, this series has been giving me a hard time. Man, what they did. What else, Brad? You can't, man. You and your posthumous collaborations. Anyway, enough of that. I got this thing in the mail from my friend Lise. So let's find out what's in here. What was I sent, Roger? I got a book in the mail. Let's see what it was. Okay, Lise is a big... she's a big Mary Shelley fan. And she sent me the Penguin Classics edition of The Last Man. She actually sent me the copy I have right now of The Last Man, which was a different edition. But she mentioned this in an email and how beautiful she thought it was. And I said, you know what? I would get that if I were buying books, but I'm not. And I already have the book, so what? But she took it upon herself to send me this really beautiful copy of The Last Man, which I read as part of Roger's Cheap Old Book Club last year. Was it last year? And I was kind of hard on it, actually, because there were things about this book which I felt, as storytelling-wise, were not great. But there was so much good stuff in here that I've continued to think about this book since I've read it. It's one of those books which just kind of lingered in my mind and I continue to think about. And I definitely will reread it one of these days, because I think this book is better than I first gave it credit for being. And now I have this, a Penguin copy, which is really, really nice. So thank you, Lise, for sending that to me. That's awesome. I knew this was coming out. And she did mention how awesome it looked. And it does. They did a great job with this. The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which I do recommend if you've not read it. And you should get this nice, pretty book. Look at that. That's great. That's great what they did with this. Wow. That's awesome. So yeah, The Last Man by Mary Shelley. Better than L. Sprague de Camp's work on Conan. There you go. So there you go. Okay. All right. We'll catch you next time.